when you're in pain, soothing as a springtime rain, to have a friend right in your corner. Your heart will feel a little warmer. Tender loving care, tender loving care. Each warm and friendly touch lets someone know you care so much. Tender loving care, tender loving care.
Good evening and welcome to Tender Loving Care. I'm the Reverend Dr. Gary Maloney, and I'll be filling in for Dr. Allman for about the next 4 or 5 weeks while he's on vacation with his wife in the Philippines. And about a month ago, I was a guest on a couple of Dr. Allman's programs, and shortly after that, he asked me if I'd host his program while he was away, and it was a privilege. I greatly accepted that offer from Greenbrier to do his program, and I thought about what I'd be doing over the next 4 or 5 weeks, and I decided I wrote a commentary about 6 years ago in the book of Proverbs about wisdom, and I thought for the first couple of weeks we'd talk a little bit about that and see what wisdom God has for us in our lives. And you know, all of us carry a collection of wisdom passed on to us by people from our past who have been most important in our lives. We have picked up this wisdom from our parents, our friends, our teachers, and our coaches as well. All the people who shaped and molded us as we were growing up. But you know, some of that wisdom that more or less was taught to us was, I believe, kind of wrong. I now realize that some of the wisdom I picked up while growing up was wrong. For instance, one motto I heard about when I was growing up was, look out for number one. By saying we need to look out after number one means that in the end, each person has to look out for his or her own interest. By looking out for number one means that I make sure that my needs are met before I try to help others meet their needs. I tried to live that motto through high school. However, when I got married, I figured out that this was not very good advice. I soon learned that two people who live by the motto, looking out for number one, cannot have a long relationship or a mutual commitment. By the time we started having kids, I realized that it was impossible to live a wise life by embracing this motto of look out for number one. What we need to do is to wise up about life. Over the next couple of programs, we are going to be looking at God's wisdom from the book of Proverbs. We are going to look at what the Bible's book of Proverbs says about some different subjects. But on this program, we are going to start by talking about God's wisdom. For our lives in general, we are going to find out what true wisdom really is, what the Proverbs are, and then some prerequisites to living wisely. Number one, what is wisdom, you may ask? The dictionary defines wisdom as the ability to discern what is true or right. So our English word wisdom has both moral implications, discerning what's right, and intellectual implications, discerning what is true. The Hebrew word translated wisdom in the Bible is a bit more colorful than our English word. The Hebrew word for wisdom is chokmah and is referred to sometimes as some type of skill or ability a person may have. So the Hebrew word distinguishes wisdom from knowledge, because a person can have a mind full of facts, but yet they lack in wisdom. Often the writers of the Bible use this word chokmah to describe people who are skilled in a trade or perhaps a craft, like woodworking or weaving and so on. Now, with the background of the word Chokmah, let's take a peek at Proverbs chapter 3, verses 19 through 20. It says, "The Lord by wisdom has founded the earth. By understanding has he established the heavens. By his knowledge the depths are broken up, and the clouds drop down the dew." These two verses represent many verses in Proverbs that describe the relationship between wisdom and God's creation. Using construction technology, the author of Proverbs pictures God as being an architect and wisdom as being like a builder. As an architect, God designs the blueprints of the universe, but then it's wisdom who builds off of that blueprint. Now, this does not mean that wisdom is a literal person. The book of Proverbs often refers to wisdom as a woman. In fact, in chapter 8 is a poem about Lady Wisdom. We do the same thing when we refer to luck as Lady Luck. So speaking of wisdom as a person is a literal device to call our attention to wisdom. You see, God is a wise God, so much so that you can almost talk about God's wisdom as if it were a person in its own right. And since the Hebrew word for wisdom in Chokmah is a feminine noun, Proverbs refers to wisdom as a woman. Because of this wisdom, wisdom just isn't an attitude of God, but it's also an attribute of God's wisdom. Because God laid the earth's foundation using wisdom, the world around us bears wisdom's imprint. So by looking at creation, we can see and understand God's wisdom. Perhaps this analogy will help you understand perhaps where I'm coming from. I'm told that at Disneyland, almost all the rides and attractions have a hidden set of Mickey Mouse ears somewhere in that attraction. This was the attraction's way of putting Walt Disney's thumbprint on every attraction. Yet, if you don't know about the hidden Mickey Mouse ears ahead of time, you don't see them. But once you know about them, you start looking. And then you start seeing the hidden ears everywhere on the attractions. In the same way, when God uses his wisdom to create the world around us, wisdom puts her mark on the world. Like hidden Mickey ears on every Disney attraction, all of God's creation has within it the fingerprint of God's wisdom. Once you know that, you can start to see that wisdom simply by looking at the world around you. Another way to think of it is to picture God's creation as being like a piece of wood. God's wisdom is the wood grain in that piece of wood. Wisdom is a structure and order of God's creation. When a woodworker works with a piece of wood, he tries to work with the wood grain rather than against the grain. Wise living is living with the grain of wisdom in the world rather than living against that wisdom. Let me give you a definition of biblical wisdom. Wisdom in the Bible is the art of skillful living by understanding and living within the order of creation. Wisdom is living with the grain and not against it. Wise living is discerning the structure and order that God built into this world, and then living our lives in harmony with that order and that structure. For now, think of wisdom as life skills that comes from understanding how God created the world around us. Now, number 2, what is Proverbs? What is Proverbs? Now, the book of Proverbs are part of the Bible's wisdom literature. So we come to the question, what exactly are Proverbs? There are actually 3 books in the Bible that belongs to the category of the wisdom books. One of those books is Proverbs, which we are looking at now. The other 2 books are Job and Ecclesiastes, which look at the darker side of wisdom. Let me give you a definite definition of Proverbs. Proverbs are short, memorable sayings whose meanings are relevant to many different situations. If you remember the movie Forrest Gump, I'm sure most of you do, the Gumpisms in that movie were Proverbs. The saying, life is like a box of chocolates. You never know what you're going to get, is a proverb, and so is stupid is as stupid does, is also a proverb. Every society has its own set of proverbs that represent the collective wisdom of that society. Allow me to give you some other examples that comes from our culture. Look before you leap. I've heard that many times over the years. Easy come, easy go. And a penny saved is a penny earned. The Bible's book of Proverbs represents the collective wisdom of ancient Israel. And because as Christians we believe the whole Bible is inspired by God, the collective wisdom of Proverbs represents God's angle on wisdom. Most of the Proverbs come from King Solomon, the guy who was king of Israel during her golden era. However, Proverbs also has wise sayings from other people as well. It is likely that the book of Proverbs started as a book perhaps to help parents instruct their children in life skills. In fact, the first 9 chapters of Proverbs are a father instructing his son in how to live wisely in the world. So Proverbs was originally a parenting strategy as moms and dads tried to equip their children to live God-centered, successful lives according to the grain of God's creation. But it is also likely that Proverbs later became a textbook in ancient Israel to prepare people to serve as leaders. In this sense, it was a textbook for equipping emerging leaders who could serve as advisors in government positions. By the time of King Solomon, there were several counselors who were known for their common sense and also their wisdom. Now it is important to understand how to apply the wise sayings from Proverbs to our lives. The sayings we find in the book of Proverbs are generalizations about what is true most of the time. They are guidelines for wise living. But we should resist not to turn them into rigid, absolute promises. These sayings tell us what usually works in most circumstances. But the Proverbs don't work in every single circumstance. In fact, the book of Job and Ecclesiastes in the Bible deal with those situations when these wise sayings don't seem to work at all. We shouldn't read Proverbs as if these wise sayings are absolute promises for laws. For example, one proverb tells us, a gentle answer turns away wrath, in Proverbs 15:1. That's true most of the time, but it is a generalization. It is not always true. But all things equal, it's true in more circumstances than it is not true. So it makes sense to give a gentle answer when someone's really mad, but this proverb is not a guarantee that a gentle answer will always diffuse the anger. Let me give you another example. One of the Proverbs tells us, The years of the wicked will be short in Proverbs 10:27. That's true more times than not, but it is not true in every single case. In most cases, a lifestyle of wickedness cuts a person's lifespan short. But as Ecclesiastes observes, this isn't true in every single case. So there are observations about how life works in most cases. This is very important to understand, especially when it comes to verses about parenting and marriage. So Proverbs are wise sayings that are relevant to many different situations. Number 3, prerequisites about wise living. Now look at some prerequisites to wise living. We begin with Proverbs 1:7. In this verse, the word knowledge, wisdom, and discipline are all being used as synonyms to describe one thing. Most Bible teachers view this verse as the motto or theme of the entire book of Proverbs. Every wise saying we find in Proverbs goes back to this fundamental promise. Now the first word we focus on in this verse is the word fear. The Hebrew word for fear can have one of three meanings. It can mean terror, it can mean respect, or it can mean worship. Clearly the meaning here isn't terror or dread, because that word be inconsistent with trusting God. So the meaning here is closer to respect or worship. Fear of the Lord is a posture of reverent worship of God. The other word to notice is the word Lord. Whenever you encounter the word Lord in all capital letters in the English translation of the Bible, behind that translation is the Hebrew word Yahweh. Yahweh was God's personal name to Israel in the Old Testament, his special covenant name. All other designations in the Old Testament were titles for God, but Yahweh is God's name. This name comes from the Hebrew verb I am, and as best as scholars can figure, Yahweh means the I am of the self-existent one. Now put the word fear together with the personal name of God. And what you have is a statement that the first principle of wisdom is to be a worshiper of the true God. Here we find the first prerequisite to live wisely. We need first to establish an authentic relationship with God. We often use the word God-fearing in our culture to mean something very different than what this biblical phrase means. When we say that that person is God-fearing, we usually mean that that person lives a life of the straight and narrow. We don't necessarily mean that the person knows God personally, but that he or she acknowledges who God is. It's like the cowboy that tips his hat to the Creator, but lives a completely different, independent life. But the phrase fear of Yahweh means more than simply acknowledging God in our lives. Fear of Yahweh refers to a special kind of a relationship. This relationship is best described as a covenant relationship, a relationship of mutual trust and commitment. In the Old Testament, this covenant relationship came through the covenant God made with the nation of Israel through Moses. But when Jesus Christ came into this world, he opened the doors to all to know God through what he called a new covenant. We come to know God in the way described by this phrase when we trust in Jesus Christ. We become reverent worshipers of God by trusting Jesus Christ's death and resurrection, believing that his death ushers us into a relationship with God. In fact, the very name Jesus means Yahweh is my salvation. So before we can seek to live wisely, we need to know the author of all wisdom personally. But the reality is that there are lots of Christians who are not very wise. Many people who trust Jesus lack the kind of life skills we expect from a true biblical wisdom. Just becoming a Christian doesn't automatically make you wise. A covenant relationship with God is a prerequisite, but we can't stop there. Let me give you a second prerequisite. To live wisely, we need to passionately pursue wisdom. In Proverbs chapter 4, verses 7 through 8, is actually part of a poem about the importance of wisdom. Notice the commands: get wisdom, get understanding, esteem wisdom, and embrace wisdom. The pursuit of wisdom is one of the most important things in our life that we can do. If we embrace wisdom like a lover, we bring true satisfaction to our lives. Now, how do we passionately pursue this kind of wisdom, you may ask? Well, we start by asking God for wisdom. In the New Testament from the Bible, we learn that if we lack in wisdom, we should ask God for wisdom. And he'll give it to us if we ask in faith, and that's in James 1:5. So we start our pursuit by admitting that we lack wisdom in our lives and by asking God for that wisdom. Often we lack wisdom because we're not humble enough to ask God for it. Sometimes as people, we're afraid to ask for stuff. I think it's our pride holds us back sometimes. But we need to ask God, and he'll help us gain that wisdom. We also can pursue wisdom by reading the Bible, especially the wisdom literature of the Bible. For several years, I used to read a chapter of Proverbs each day, with the chapter corresponding to the day of the month. So on the first of the month, I'd read chapter 1. On the second day of the month, I would read chapter 2, and so on throughout the month. Another way to pursue wisdom is by developing the art of observation. Most of the wise sayings in the book of Proverbs didn't come by direct revelation from God. God didn't reveal these wise sayings through dreams or visions or by an audible voice. Instead, God revealed these wise sayings through people's observational skills, what you might call sanctified common sense. Most often, Proverbs works in this way. A person is walking along the road and he notices the yard of a lazy person. He notices that the yard is overgrown with weeds, that the wall around the yard are broken down and in need of repair. Then the observer tells us, I saw and I considered it. I looked and I received instructions. A little sleep, a little slumber, and poverty will come upon you like a robber. Proverbs 24:30 through 34. That's how most of the Proverbs came, from careful observation combined with reflection. So observe the world around you. See what's going on. Watch how people respond and what kind of consequences come from different types of actions. And one final way we can pursue wisdom is by reading. Historians of ancient history have observed that many of the wise sayings in the book of Proverbs are identical to the wise sayings archaeologists have uncovered from ancient societies. like Egypt and other countries. It's like that during Solomon's reign also. It was like that. When Israel became powerful, that Israel leaders encountered these wise sayings of the Egyptians and that of other nations. They accepted these wise sayings that they felt were consistent with fear of Yahweh. And eventually these wise sayings were incorporated into the Bible. They rejected those wise sayings that were inconsistent with the fear of Yahweh. We can do the same thing these wise men and women did by reading widely, looking for wisdom wherever we might find it. Whether it's Newsweek or Reader's Digest, reading biographies and or the latest nonfiction bestsellers, we can learn from people, even those people who are not Christians. I'm going to stop right there for this week. That was the first prerequisite. Next week I'll get into the second prerequisite of pursuing wisdom. But again, I want to thank Channel 3 for allowing me to come up here for this taping today. I also want to thank Dr. Greenbrier Allman for trusting in me to take care of his program over the next several weeks. I've really enjoyed coming up here and doing this, and like I say, next week we'll go to the second prerequisite to the pursuit of wisdom. For Greenbrier Allman, this is Reverend Dr. Gary Maloney saying good night and God bless you, and we'll see you next week.
Stories of a West Virginia Doctor, written by Dr. Harold D. Allman. A collection of 55 short stories about his experience as a small-town doctor in central West Virginia. And Tender Loving Care, Stories from a West Virginia Doctor, Volume 2, written by Dr. Greenbrier Allman, using videotapes to write 70 additional stories of his father's very colorful life as a small-town doctor. They can be found for purchase at Amazon.com and most local bookstores. Tune into Channel 3 Buckhannon for Tender Loving Care with Dr. Greenbrier Allman, where he talks about the connection between Christianity and medicine.